This is a video of what I hope will be documentation of some of the accomplishments that have been made during my life. Um, if we put this together in the order in which I hope we are able to put it in, it will include chronologically the things that happened during my youth, family activities growing up, a little more time perhaps on college and some of the things that came out of the school that I went to, then a military career. Following a military career, transitioned to work in industry for a short time, then teaching in college for about 5 years. Then I started a company. It was called Systems Management and Development Corporation. And during the management of that company, we were able to do a number of things that were pretty significant that I thought were worthy of capturing on film to have some documentation for the future. So this is the way we'll unfold the data following, and hopefully it'll be not just data and informative, but maybe some things that will stimulate you for your life as well. You'll find that as we go through this, the guy who's put it together for us is going to weave together some of the material that I'm saying here and this type of recording, along with some pictures and videos that I've provided him. And we're doing something that's kind of new. It's not something we find every day on the street corner, but he calls it a life tribute. I'd like to think of it as kind of an extension of genealogy research, being able to capture and put in one package some things that may otherwise take a lot of time and effort to dig around and find. Some of the things that you're going to find are things like a person who's gone through life with a happy childhood, doing well in small schools where they lived in small towns. In my case, the little town that I grew up in had fewer than 600 people, and you don't have to be too great to look good among 600 people. I moved from that town to a little larger town that had about 8,000 people when I was around 14 years old. And being thrust into the larger town where you had other kids your age that were playing in sports that you had never participated in, I found myself as kind of a chubby little kid checking into the 9th grade in the middle of a high school, the school year in a new high school. Principal decided that I should be in the football team since I was a little heavier than an average kid. I don't mean big, I mean I was just a little chubby. So I found myself in the gym class with a football team, guys, and I didn't feel at all adequate. And I was out running the track and doing the things that they were all doing, and not getting to play any football because I wasn't a football player. Well, that lasted about a semester, and then fortunately that part of the school year was over. Throughout my 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, I was influenced by some great teachers. We were fortunate that there were 2 colleges in that town, and a lot of the wives of the college professors were teaching in our high school. And I think we even looked back in years later and recognized that out of the about 100 people who graduated from my high school class, 7 had gone on to become doctors, either medical doctors or PhDs, which is a pretty high percentage for about 100 people graduating. And I attribute that to a great education, great teaching, great teachers, and we just had some really outstanding people there at the school. Fortunately also, with those 2 colleges, I was able to go to college, which I wouldn't have been otherwise, because the schools only had probably 16 to 1800 people in the entire college 4-year group. But while the schools have grown as they were at that time, that small, we had a lot of personal attention from the professors. So we found ourselves small school, getting a lot of attention, giving us the ability to be discovered or excel in those areas that we did well in. My areas that I tended to do best in were areas of math and science. And while I was no great mathematician nor a great scientist, I was doing well enough that I developed some confidence in my abilities and myself. Money was a pretty tough thing for us back then. My dad left the family when I was only 15, 16 years old, and it left my mother with 2 very young daughters, and I was in high school, and my sister, 3 years younger than I, were 4 at home, and she was a waitress and had no income other than that. So I was working as a car hop at a Dairy Queen, and later changing tires at a service station, trying to assist her in paying rent on a house. It turns out, by the way, when my father left, about a month later, we got a call from some people saying they wanted to take over possession of the house. And we didn't understand what that meant until they told us that he had sold the home to them and forged my mother's signature on the deed, meaning we had no place to live. So we moved to a street that was had an old house on it. It cost us, I think, $50 a month. You can imagine what you get for a house for $50 a month. And that's about what we got. It was a really run-down, dilapidated place. But at any rate, it was a place for us to live. After about 4 years, after my dad had gone and been gone for about 4 years, my mother married again. And in her second marriage, while I still had the younger sisters at home that had seen me as the only male figure in the house, I recognized that it probably wouldn't be too healthy for him to try to be their father and me being home, and them looking to me for guidance and information and even parenting. So I moved out of the house into a room while I was finishing college, and they ended up doing all right and staying at home with their new stepfather. During the time that I was in college, one really outstanding thing happened, and I considered this one of those godlike events that occurs in your life occasionally. While I had taken the idea of working my way through school as being a natural thing that was going to happen, I was unprepared, surprised for sure, but we had a professor of military science, and I had gone through the ROTC program with the expectation of doing 2 years of reserve duty in the military afterwards. But we had a professor of military science that had retired, and a new person had come in to take his place. And because I was still working and knew that I'd have to work through my years of getting out, I had delayed what we called our summer camp until the summer following graduation, rather than the summer between junior and senior year like most of the guys did. So everyone else would be graduating in May, and my final graduation wouldn't occur until I finished my summer camp. That's when I would get my commission for being a lieutenant in the Army as a result of ROTC. Well, in May, in fact May the 12th, just before graduation, Lieutenant Colonel Adams called me and Billy Hudson and Gerald Murders into his office and said, gentlemen, as a professor of military science, we're seeking people that have leadership abilities as well as getting good grades and being able to make things happen in life. And while we've identified and designated about 10 men already to be distinguished military students, and they will graduate as distinguished military graduates. He said, I've noticed that you three are working your way through school, and yet you've done all the things that are necessary to demonstrate leadership, other than being able to participate in the school politics of being involved socially. But I've gone back to 4th Army headquarters and I've asked for 3 additional designations, and you 3 are receiving them. Well, at the time I didn't realize what significance that was, but looking back at his wisdom and what he saw, I became a doctorate in engineering. Billy Hudson became a PhD research medical researcher in kidney dysfunctions, and Gerald Murders owns a business in Hot Springs. So he obviously recognized something in young people. Both Billy and I, after college, went through our summer camps, and then we got our commissions following summer camps and went into the military. I went in immediately as a second lieutenant. Billy went on to graduate study and got his PhD, and then he went in 4 years after I did with a doctorate in bioscience. In my case, being a regular officer, which I was entitled to be rather than a reserved officer because of the Distinguished Military Graduate Certificate, it gave me an ability to go to schools, get selected for the Army's position. It was selecting people for schools that were career-oriented rather than instant use. Reserves are there for instant 2-year application. Those that were in what we call AUS, Army of the United States, were expected to be for the long term. And so I got selected for a number of schools, and those included schools in science and engineering and nuclear weapon development and things such as that. Sort of comical aside from that, in 1966 and 67, after having been selected for a number of schools, by that time I had discovered where my father was and written to him and had some back and forth conversations with him. But he wrote me a letter when I told him that I had been selected for yet another school. He wrote a letter, and having completed only 3 years of school himself, he said, I know I didn't go to a lot of schools, but he said, I know the value of education. And he said, you just wait. The Army is going to get you in a school where they'll teach you something and they'll find something you can do, so don't you worry about it. So I guess he was thinking that all those schools they were sending me to weren't taking, and they would eventually find something I could do. I thought that was sort of humorous. After getting into my final year, and in fact just finishing my final year in college, I sent an announcement of my graduation to the district attorney of the state of California, and I asked him if he would try to find my father. I gave him a social security number, and I said, I think he's somewhere in the state of California. Of course, I didn't know for sure where he was. And 3 weeks later, I got a letter from my father, and he had been gone for 7 years, 6 years, something like that, and had never received a letter from him, didn't know where he was. But I got this letter from him that said, I'm very surprised that you were able to finish college. Congratulations. Obviously not expecting that any of us would be doing anything beyond minimal survival, I guess. But as soon as I got the letter, I contacted my mother and told her that I had gotten information from her father and knew where he was and everything. So I took her and the letter and went down to the local lawyer and filed for child support. So I thought that was a meaningful thing. After going into the military, I went to Germany. I was in something called air defense artillery. Now the military, Army part of the military is broken into what's called combat arms services and non-combat arms. And the combat arms include things like infantry and artillery and armor and those things that do shooting and killing. Non-combat arms are things like medical service and logistics type areas, signal and supply. And I was in one of the combat arms organizations. In fact, it was artillery, but it was a special kind of artillery. It's the kind that shoots down airplanes rather than shoots shells. If you were a regular Army officer and you were in one of the combat arms, there's an expectation that you would go through a preparatory training that would either qualify you to jump out of airplanes and be able to go into areas through means of paratrooping, or that you would become a snake eater, ranger type person that would go in and kill people in the dark of night with a slice of a knife. Well, I was not a large person, nor was I a macho type guy, but I said, if you're going to do this, you ought to do it right, so I volunteered for both of them. Not the kind of thing that means I had great intelligence. So I was, as soon as my Air Defense Artillery 8 weeks course was over, I was sent immediately to airborne training. And while I was going through the airborne training, which was in the December-January time frame, I was waiting, as soon as that was over, to go into the Ranger training, which was Special Forces type training. And while I was waiting for that, they sent me a letter saying, well, that class is full, so I should go on to my next assignment and apply to go to that course when I come back from Germany. So fortunately for me, I guess I didn't go to that course. Before I got back from Germany, I'd gotten married, and I came back without an expectation that you had to be a hired killer to do well in the military, that you could probably do that all right without doing that. So while I was in the military, there were a lot of things that happened, kind of following up on the education thought. One of those things was that I got a letter from people in Department of Army headquarters saying that they had reviewed my academic background, and it appeared that my BSE, which meant Bachelor of Science in Education to me, apparently to them it meant Bachelor of Science in Engineering, because they thought that I was fully qualified for an engineering course at the graduate level called Missile Systems Engineering. And they asked if I would be willing to go to that course. When the 9 months of training was over, I would be qualified to serve on the Joint Chiefs staff and Secretary of Defense staff, advising them on major missile system development. Sounded good to me, so I reviewed the things that they said were background requirements, and they included multiple years of calculus, differential equations, engineering courses of all different types, and I said, I haven't had half of these things. But at the same time, I said, but if there's somebody else in the military that can go through these courses, I can too, because I think I'm as smart as the other people in the military, so I volunteered. Well, it turned out that everybody in the course, besides me, had an engineering background. And in fact, it was a graduate engineering course, and we were spending roughly a week going through a refresher on Calculus 1, a week on Refresher 2, a week on Refresher of differential equations, a few days on physics and nuclear physics and all of those things, and I was working my buns off trying to keep up with everybody. Well, at the end of 9 months, while it was something that I did all right in, I had really expended more brain energy than I had ever intended to. But I thought to make really good use of that time, I would take my graduate record exams and go down to the local university, which was the University of Texas at El Paso, and see what the requirement would be to get an engineering degree if I'd gone through all that effort. So I went down and gave them a copy of the background of what I'd been studying. They looked it over and said, well, if you can come here for full-time training in 1 year and a summer, we can get you a master's degree in electrical engineering. And I said, a master's degree in electrical engineering? You realize, of course, that I don't have an undergraduate engineering degree. How about that? Does that make a difference? And they said, well, it appears that these courses you've been taking in engineering for the last 9 months at the graduate level, you passed okay. That'll take care of all your undergraduate deficiencies. So if you can get assigned here for a year and a summer, you'll get a master's. Well, I thought that was outstanding. So I had them write a letter, go back to Department of Army headquarters and explain that. Department of Army headquarters thought that was outstanding also, and they sent me a letter back saying, congratulations, we're going to send you on a trip to Vietnam. And after you come back from Vietnam, we'll consider sending you to school. That wasn't exactly what I was hoping for, but that's the way it went down. And by the way, when I came back from Vietnam, they sent me to school there. So after a year and a summer of school at the University of El Paso at Texas, El Paso, Texas, I finished a master's in electrical engineering and got assigned to a great job working in what was called the acquisition process for the government. That was my first job working in what later became a lifetime of work in government acquisitions. And that was really setting up and understanding how the government goes through the process of defining, designing, and producing, and then building, buying the equipment. Later, many things occurred between then and what I'm about to tell you, but later I finished 20 years of military and taught at a college that the government put in place specifically for that purpose of teaching people how to do the program management, systems engineering aspects of developing new weapon systems. And after teaching there for 5 years, I started a company called called the Systems Management and Development Corporation, SMDC. And as a result of owning that company, I had a number of clients that that had engineering tasks for the government and program management tasks for the government. And to the best of my knowledge, my company was the only company in the country at the time that was teaching that kind of work to those companies. And because there were no others doing it, I ended up being the person who trained either me or members of my company, ended up being those people who trained Lockheed, Boeing, Rockwell, ATT, Kodak, General Dynamics, practically all the large corporations that were making equipment for the government. And for about 15 years, we were the leading company doing that kind of thing. Now, while the material that is going to be sandwiched through this film, it's going to include some pictures and charts and graphs and things, you'll see that the primary thrust of this is not just what happened to Troy Caver as he went through his life, but there are also a number of what I would call godly events that occurred through that life. Some of those included things like an airplane incident where I ran completely out of fuel over the mountains of Georgia with a wife and 2 children on board. Ended up without any damage to me or any significant damage to the plane, yet on the ground safe. Other of those events included things like what happened being in my selection for schools in the military that had no real explanation. Certainly I wasn't qualified for them, yet was selected for them, perhaps because of a misunderstanding of the Bachelor of Science in Education versus Bachelor of Science in Engineering. I don't know. And there are other events that occurred as well. One in particular, I had a sense that our church needed to have a new church in the town that we lived in. We didn't have a church of that denomination. And felt strongly that there was a calling from God that we establish that and that we'd be a key couple in doing that. So my home had a large open basement in it. I thought, well, I'll see what I can do or need to do to kind of make that happen. So we left the church that we were attending and started attending a church very near our home, but one that was growing rapidly, and I wanted to just kind of get some ideas from them on what they were doing for church growth, and picked up a number of things that I thought were good ideas. And while we were going to their church in the daytime, we were setting up meeting places at our home for nighttime to start gathering and developing a congregation for our denomination. So we put the word out through the community that if you're interested in this particular denomination, or we're having church services on Sunday night there. Now, along with this, the military post nearby, which was Fort Belvoir, Virginia, had something that they put in the paper, said we've got a number with some warehouse products that we're selling. So of those warehouse products, I dropped a sealed bid of $25 in for one thing and $50 for another, and they were chairs and vacuum cleaners. You know, don't really need a lot of chairs and vacuum cleaners, but I just dropped a sealed bid in, and I got a call saying my bid had won on both of those. Well, when I went to get the chairs, it turned out that it was something like 150 stacked metal chairs with leather cushions and leather backs. Now, those chairs would cost roughly $50 to $100 a piece, and I got about 150 of them for 25 bucks. Now, for anybody else, you'd say, that's really a coincidence, and what are you going to do with them? But for me, I had a need for them. They were the chairs that made up our first congregation. So while I had a large open area in my basement, I now had padded chairs in the open area of the basement, which was the home of our first congregation. We'd been attending there and gathering people for maybe 2 or 3 months. I call the district superintendent, that's the guy who's responsible for geographical area for that denomination. I called him and told him that we thought we had enough people attending there that we wanted to start it as a church. And he said, well, that's not the way we normally do things. You know, we normally start a church with the church deciding to start a church, not a few people deciding to start a church. I said, well, I can understand that, and this isn't something that I decided to do. It was something that we were led to do, believing that we were following God's will. And we were going to start a new church on the 5th of May, and if he was there to decide it was one from his denomination, then it would be. But if he wasn't there, we'd be an independent church on the 5th of May. He showed up, and he passed out some little pieces of paper asking questions like, what's your age, and what kind of job you have, what kind of education do you have, and what's your commitment that you're willing to make to contributions to the church for a year. And he passed that to all the people who were attending there with us. He got the papers back and looked them over, and he said, man, we've got more leadership and more financial support in this church than we do in 50% of them in Virginia already. So I declare this today the Church of the Springfield, Nazarene Church of Springfield, Virginia. And so we became that. Some other things occurred during that same time in the growth of that church, and then some things later along with that church that just led me to believe that when God asks you to do something, he doesn't necessarily make it clear to everybody else that you're supposed to do that. It's a personal call, and that personal call becomes one that you have to first of all be willing to listen for, but then when you recognize it and you internalize it, it becomes something that you are completely convinced is between you and him. And as you undertake it and you see doors opened and things happen that wouldn't normally happen under other circumstances, you become even more convinced that God is leading in what he's having done. Now for me personally, a greater commitment as to why that was true. During this same time, I had developed and was developing some sense of what I was going to do and where I was going to go in my own life. And in that time frame, that was around 1987, 88 time frame. In that time frame, I wrote down some things that were objectives and goals that I had, and there was a book put out by a guy, and the name of the book was Think and Grow Rich. It wasn't growing rich that was important, but the idea of the book was that if you put in place those things that are of importance that you're willing to undertake, and you commit to doing those things, and you do it believing that God is working in your life and will assist you if you identify direction that is of importance to you and communicate with Him, that He will help you in doing it. Now, I was so completely convinced that was true. I had a tape of that book, and I played that tape every day going to and from work. And the tape required that you, or the book and also on the tape, required that you state clearly what your objectives were, and you state clearly what you're willing to commit to make those objectives occur. And that included things like, I'm willing to give a week, a year of my time to this, or I'm willing to give a certain, whatever it is that you're willing to do or commit to. And so in that process, I wrote all those things out. Now to tell you that these are not necessarily all God things, they were very material things for me. It was, I wanted to ensure that I had enough finances to be secure in my life. I wanted to own my own home. I wanted to get promoted in the military career that I had had to a certain position. By then I'd finished that, but those were some things that I had as objectives. I wanted to own my own airplane, numbers of things that I wanted to do that I had documented earlier, saying these are things I want to do. So when I was undertaking this Think and Grow Rich thing that I was working on, I started recognizing that the doors were opening for each of those things to occur. And so the idea of one of them was to own my own business. Well, I was approached by someone from Rockwell International while I was at the college that I was teaching at during the same time. And they said, we need to have a team of people come and train our people in the program management acquisition process. And if you'll do that, we've got enough business that you can do it full time, and you wouldn't continue to be a faculty member of the college. And I felt that that was affirmation enough for me, so I said, okay, I'll undertake that. So with a couple of other guys, we started a company, and the company had as its first full-time client Rockwell International, and the company was the Systems Management and Development Corporation, which I was the president of. And that company continues to exist today as 2005, and we incorporated in 1988, January 1988. And just as kind of an understanding of how you step out in faith and don't know what's going to happen on that, the first year I told my wife we're going to mortgage our home if necessary to pay for a 5-year lease on an office, and I don't have any idea how this is going to work out, but we're undertaking it. At the end of the 5-year lease, if things have gone well, we'll move into our own office. If they haven't gone well, we'll probably have lost our home maybe by then, which wasn't something I wanted to happen, of course. Well, we took a $40,000 salary each that first year, which wasn't very large, and we had money left over, which meant we were profitable with only a $40,000 salary. So the three owners split up the money that was left. The company was successful and we did all right, but because of circumstances and people wanting to do things one way versus another, we ended up splitting the company up so that I became the owner of the company, and the other two guys left that company, and one of them started another company and the other was not in either of them. But in 1980, at the end of 1988, we had probably a $20,000 distribution. In 1993, I submitted an income tax return with $990,000 as my taxable income. So, was God responsible? Well, I certainly give him credit for being a participating partner. And the company continued to do well, and I felt that there were periods of my life where things were going on where I recognized God's participation in helping choose the outcome. I think another example back in the starting up of the church that's meaningful. We were getting our first pastor, and the guy who was coming to talk to us didn't know he was going to be our pastor. He was coming to talk to us about some of the problems of starting a new church, and he recognized the enthusiasm and the feeling we had about it. And we were driving down the road, and he said, "Well, Troy, if you were going to build a church somewhere in this area, where would you want to put it?" And I said, "Well, this area is kind of developing, as you see here." And I said, "You know, just over this hill to the left maybe would be a good place for it." And so we topped the hill, and to the left there sits a Lutheran church. And I thought, isn't that a coincidence? You know, I didn't know the area that we were in that well, but I thought that's really a coincidence. So after I took him back to where he was staying that night, I drove back to that church just because of that feeling of coincidence. And I drove up to the church, and there was only one car out in front of it, and I went inside, and the pastor was at his desk, and I went in and told him that we were starting a new church, and that just the coincidence of his church being right at the place that we were talking about. And I said, "By the way," I said, we're growing a little too large now for the basement that I've got, and we're looking for a place that we can have services." I said, do you by chance have any space here that we could use?" And it turned out that because of the services they had, that meeting on Sunday evening at his church would be an okay thing. Well, we had checked into meeting in different buildings and knew what the cost would be, and so I was kind of choking on the answer to my next question, and I said, "Well, for us to use your facility, what kind of fee would you need?" And he said, "Well, it sounds to me like we're both in the same business, and I wouldn't need any money from you at all." So